Good morning. We are going to continue what we started last Tuesday night, and this will be part two of a subject that you may hear the title and say, yeah, that's what's going on. Or you may say, I don't know if that's what's going on or not, but the title is We Live in a Pleasure Mad Society. In other words, a culture that everything has to be play. And we started out in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 6, where we read of the nation Israel, that they rose up early on the next day and they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Taking a verse out of the context like that, you don't get the idea that as to what really is going on. But what was going on was the nation Israel was waiting for Moses to come down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments and the laws from God that they had committed themselves to obey. And unfortunately, they didn't use the time that they were waiting wisely. And so they had a pagan or a false god made out of the ear gold that they had taken from the Egyptians when they came out of Egypt, and made a golden calf out of it. And Aaron told them that this is the God that brought them out of the land of Egypt. And we're told that they ate and they drank and they rose up and played. And actually, I'm going to get there, and we're going to spend more time with that, because to me, that is such an amazing series of events, in light of the virtually immediate history that Israel at that time had experienced, having gone down into Egypt because they were, and then this would go back a significant period of time, but because there was a famine in the land and they didn't have food to eat, they get down there and they find out that the guy that's in charge of distributing food in Egypt, the number two man, was their brother Joseph that they'd sold into bondage. But then Joseph doesn't get even with them, and he provides food, and they're invited down to Egypt, and they live in with good rapport with the Egyptians, and they prosper well. And then we read that another Pharaoh rose that didn't know Joseph, who was one of the children of Israel, and so then he became afraid of the children of Israel, that as they were multiplying and growing, and they were getting stronger and more powerful, and possibly there would be a war, and then they might turn against the Egyptians. So they wanted to limit their growth, weaken them as a nation, stop their multiplication as far as the numbers of people that represented the nation Israel at that time. And so they were in the process of trying to really work them to death and starve them to death in a form of in the form of slavery that was really beyond slavery. It was, they were demanding certain production. They were withdrawing the straw that normally was used to produce the bricks that they were building, and they demanded that they produce the same number of straws, same number of bricks when they had to go looking for straw than what they were making when they had the straw delivered to them. It was unfair and everything else. But as I always try to do, I was trying to lay the foundation for the fact that those accounts in the Hebrew scriptures are there for our learning. And we, if we realize that, we of course closed out Tuesday night at 2 Timothy 3, I think in verse 10. And I want to start out this morning in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, and quickly get through it and then get down to Egypt. But the Apostle Paul writes again to the church of Corinth, and he says, "Brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses and in the cloud and in the sea, And they all ate that same spiritual food, and they all drank that same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now, then, for some of you, that might be kind of surprising, because maybe you think that Christ, Jesus Christ, our Lord Jesus Christ, the full name, but Christ didn't exist until he was born of a Virgin Mary in the form of a man. But that isn't true. But a lot of people think that. But the rock that followed them was Christ. And then the 5th verse says, but with most of them, God was not well pleased. Well, Paul is speaking about the people that we read about in Exodus 32:6, that they sat down and ate and drank and rose up to play. And when you follow the history of the nation Israel, quite often back in that time frame and following that significantly, they got involved in playing games, funny games with the idolatrous inhabitants of the land that they were to occupy. They took on their practices. They got entangled in the worship of their false gods. And it was all kind of in the realm of play. But God was not well pleased with them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And of that group of which that statement is made in Exodus 32:6, they are of that group of people that died in the wilderness. When they finally got to the promised land and they were about to go in, those people went in, spied out the land. Caleb and Joshua came back and said, we can take the land if God is with us. The 10 spies that were with them said, it's a beautiful land, it's a wonderful land, but there are giants in the land. We look like grasshoppers in our eyes in presence of these giants, and we look like grasshoppers in their eyes too. And we can't win. We can't win. And they forgot at that point later on the border of the land that God had promised to them, that they had traveled to finally and arrived finally. They got to the borders and forgot. Well, the statement in Exodus 32, they forgot also all that God had done in the immediate past, not in the future, immediate past, all that God had done to bring them to that place where they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up in the mountain to receive the commandments from God, and they're waiting for him to come back, and they get bored, I guess, because they weren't having enough fun or something, and they decide to make a golden calf and dance and sing and play around that golden calf and say, as we'll look at in just a minute, these be your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And again, to me, it's shocking. And yet I realize it's so true of human nature. That's why I feel like the condition of which we're in our culture in the United States of America today, where almost nothing can be done unless that you make it fun, and work, particularly hard work, particularly maybe if it's kind of boring work, or it produces sore backs, which I've been dealing with here lately, or it produces sore hands or blisters on your hands. That's a terrible thing. But to have fun, if you're going to teach a child something in school, why they try to make fun out of it. They try to make games out of teaching. When I had to learn the multiplication tables, I just had to learn the multiplication tables. Did I like to memorize the multiplication tables? No, I didn't, but I did do it, and I do use it, and have used it all of my life. But then I've recently been talking to some of my relatives that are couple generations behind me, or ahead of me, and they say, well, that's boring to have to do it. You need to learn it this way. If you learn it this way, then they make fun out of it. Okay, there's a sense in which some of that may be all right, but then to live a life that it's given to play, just and I did some research. I don't spend a lot of time because it's not hard to find of the billions, literally billions of dollars that are spent in the United States just over play, just play, billions of dollars. And we talk about how tight it is and how short the funds are and how maybe food is going to be scarce in the United States because of some decisions made by our politicians. And I think it probably may be all of that, but we're spending billions of dollars for play, billions, literally. And so in verse 6, Paul says, these became our examples. So that's why, if you follow the ministry that I've had a part in during length of time, I frequently go back to the Hebrew scriptures. I frequently make application of things done by the nation Israel under the Mosaic law that to me defy human logic, except I know that it's quite common to all of mankind to do the same kind of a thing. But these things, the information that's recorded for us in the Hebrew scriptures are our examples to the intent that we should not lust. We should not become idolaters. And it refers back to that expression in Exodus 32:6. So let me read it in context. These things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, nor become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Quoted right out of Exodus 32:6. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and on one day 23,000 fell, they died. Nor let us tempt Christ. The rock that followed them was Christ, and they tempted Christ way back there. The children of Israel did. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain. We all complain sometimes, and we probably all should save our breath. But anyway, nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. This is the point. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. So when we read, and I hope we all read and study, and we will read the accounts, the things that Israel did, good and bad for that matter, but the times that they were blessed by God and the times that it resulted in cursing from God, that we read those and say, how does that apply to me? What is there in my life? Now, none of us are sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai killing time while Moses is up in Mount Sinai getting the tables of stone and the laws from God. So none of us are going to be tempted in that way, but all of us are going to be sometime in situations where we don't have anything really that occupies our mind, and maybe in nothing that we really have to do. And so how do we default? What do we do in those times? What do we do with those times? Do we waste those times? Do we try to find something to play during those times? What do we do? Again, verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10. All these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And I've been thinking about something, Mark, to comment on that last phrase from verse 11, but all my life I've lived looking for the last days, Well, then the latter days. or in the end times, or when are the last days going to come? The more I read and study the scriptures, the more I believe we have been in the last days, as far as God's concerned, ever since the church began, almost, if not totally. The Apostle Paul didn't expect 2,000 years to run before Christ's return, and that's okay. Every generation of believers we're supposed to live our life as though He may come tomorrow, and therefore that would undoubtedly affect some of our applications of our time and energies and what we spend our time doing. But again, think of that verse 11 and then the last phrase in the sentence. All these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. The Apostle Paul wrote that to the church in Corinth, roughly, let's just say 15 years after the first Pentecost, following the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Paul wrote, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Are they getting worse and worse? Yeah, times are going to get worse and worse, right on up to the end. But it's been doing that consistently up to today. So when we go back and we look at that period of time, when Israel is down in bondage, and again, to me, what God did for the nation Israel, in all that we have in Exodus, starting with actually probably about the 5th chapter of Exodus. I'm not going to start there, but we can. But go back and read the account. Israel is struggling. Israel is suffering. Israel is under the control of a nation that is trying to exterminate them, at least to the degree of limiting their population growth and their physical and financial might in that situation. That's a bad situation. And then it deteriorates to the point that the rulers that are over them, the Egyptian government, the pharaohs, they're telling the people that are having delivering babies, they're telling them to exterminate the male children, the midwives, and so, but the midwives are refusing to do it, and their justification for it is that the Israeli women are not weak like the Egyptian women, and they wouldn't stand for that. Well, that undoubtedly some truth to that, but so Exodus chapter 7 is where I'm going to break into, and they cry out to God in their pain and their misery and their suffering, and God remembers the promise, the covenant that He made to Abraham. Well, He made to Abraham a promise that he would have a nation that was so numerous, descendants of his, that you couldn't count it any more than you can count the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. And if they get exterminated in Egypt, well, that certainly isn't going to be fulfilled. Abraham was promised that there was going to be one of his descendants that would bless all nations, looking forward to the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, when He came in the form of a man, humbled Himself as a man, took on the form of a man, and then humbled Himself unto death, even the death of the cross. They would be given a land, a significant, large portion of land that they, to this day, have not completely occupied. They occupy a portion of it, and no matter how many times people like the Egyptians want to exterminate or at least limit, if not totally annihilate, the nation, nobody has succeeded in all these years that are part of the last days and and yet they, the nation Israel, who were delivered out of that bondage, who saw amazing signs and wonders performed by Moses and Aaron for the purpose of, of convincing Pharaoh that God existed, God was powerful, and if you're smart, you're going to let God's people go on 3 days' journey into the wilderness to worship God. But Pharaoh wasn't very smart, and I won't read all of it, but I will comment probably on several of the signs and wonders that God performed at the hands of Moses and Aaron, because that's what the people that were sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai seemed to have forgotten all about when they gave Aaron the gold and the earrings of gold and various jewelry and things like that they had gotten from the Egyptians when they spoiled the Egyptians coming out of Egypt. And he makes a gold calf out of it and tells them this is what brought them out of Egypt. And in working with Pharaoh, Pharaoh has what are referred to in my translation as magicians. The New International is one, New King James, not the New International. New King James, one I most often use. Magicians, and they could do some things like Moses turned his staff into a snake. They could do something that was convincing, that they turned their staffs or a staff or something into a snake. But Moses' serpent, it ate up the magician's serpents. So there were things that in this that there was a battle between the spirit that controlled Pharaoh and the Spirit of God going on right there before their eyes. And just kind of as a summary, in Exodus 7, 11, we read, and 12, Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, so the magicians of Egypt, and they also did in like manner with their enchantments, making a staff into a serpent. Every man threw down his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Okay, so yeah, you can do the same thing, but ours is stronger than yours. In the 8th chapter, in verse 18, the magicians so worked in their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. They had duplicated several, I think 3 of the amazing things that Moses and Aaron were able to do at God's instruction, and the magicians couldn't go any further. They couldn't make lice. And then in the 9th chapter of Exodus and the 11th verse, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of boils, because one of the plagues that God brought on the Egyptians was boils. And the boils were on the magicians and on all the Egyptians, and not on the Israelites. And the musicians of Pharaoh couldn't even stand before the king and try to do whatever the king wanted them to do. They couldn't do it because of the boils. So when we go back and think about it from that perspective, that God had delivered Israel out of Egypt. God had led them through a short part of the journey to the promised land, to Mount Sinai. He fed them with manna in the wilderness when they were hungry. He provided them with water out of the rock when they were thirsty. He went before them as a pillar of cloud, and he went before them and a fire at night. And then when they get to Mount Sinai, and by the way, if you follow that, you'll find that almost every time there was a chance that they could have said, well, you know what, this looks pretty bad, but I remember when we got to the Red Sea, we couldn't go across, and Pharaoh was coming behind us. And God told Moses to take his staff and pointed across the water, and the waters parted on both sides, and we went through on dry land. And when Pharaoh came behind, he drowned, and that was the end of him and his military chariots and all at that time. So I'm sure God will figure out something. They could have said that, but they didn't. They complained against Moses and Aaron. You bring us out here to die because there's not enough graves in Egypt. They forgot, almost instantly forgot. When they were given manna, they were told how much to pick up every day. They were told if they kept more than that amount, it was referred to as an omer of manna. If they kept more than that amount, it would breed worms and stink. Except for on the sixth day, you need to pick up twice as much, because on the seventh day it's going to be a Sabbath and there's not going to be any. And so if you don't pick up twice as much on the sixth day, then you're going to be hungry on the seventh day. And if you picked up twice as much on the sixth day, when I told you not to on the other 5 days, well, it won't breed worms and stink on the sixth day. You can eat it on the seventh. Simple. But some went out to get it on the seventh day, and there wasn't any, and some picked up too much on the first 5 days, and sure enough, it bred worms and stank. They get to the place where they're thirsty again. They don't just say, well, I guess God's going to take care of us. And I think when you talk about being an example for us, how often is that true of us? How many things happen, and actually we don't have from God the promise of physical success and supply of all of our physical needs, but we do have that godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise not only of the life that now is, but that which is to come. And we do know that in the final analysis, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those that are called according to a purpose. We don't need to get upset. We don't need to get angry. We don't need to get frustrated. We don't need to complain against God or people that are in our way as we look at things. But we do. We do. So again, this is what we need to get from the accounts that we have in the Hebrew Scriptures. So in Exodus 7, God is talking to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, see, I made you a God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet, and you shall speak all that I command you. And Aaron your brother shall speak to Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of this land. And then he says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. Okay, so when Moses goes and makes his request to Pharaoh, he doesn't know who God is, and he's not going to let Israel go. That's basically his attitude. And before he finally lets them go, only to change his mind and try to go get them, he's going to experience some things, and Israel's going to be the beneficiaries of some amazing things. So, and God is telling Moses, Pharaoh's heart is going to be hard, and my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt, I'm going to multiply them. And verse 4, he says, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay hand on Egypt, bring my armies, God's armies, and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. Amazing things that would catch the attention, things that should cause us to trust, cause them to trust, cause them to be loyal and faithful to the God of their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it didn't. They got all busy wanting to eat and drink and play. after they made a phony golden idol, a calf, out of the gold that they took from the Egyptians. God goes on to tell Moses in verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded them, so they did. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. And so the Lord tells Moses in verse 8 and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, show a miracle for yourselves, then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and let it become a serpent. Moses did, and it became a serpent. And the statement in verse 10 says, Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh, and they did so just as the Lord commanded. That's what everybody ought to do. That's what we should do. Now, the Lord isn't commanding any of us today to have a rod or a staff to walk on, walking staff, that we could cast down and turn into a serpent. Isn't doing that today. That's not his program. But he has a program. And it's the same God and the same power and the same awe and worship and love and faithfulness to him we should demonstrate, as Israel should have demonstrated, as they sat at the foot of Mount Sinai, waiting for Moses to come back with the law that they had already committed themselves to obey, and which they had already violated before they even heard it. That's human nature. So Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh. It became a serpent. Pharaoh called the wise men and the sorcerers. So the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. I don't know whether they had some kind of sleight of hand, whether they had, or if they really had some kind of magical power that enabled them to look alike or to create something that was considered by some of them to be a serpent. They did in like manner with their enchantments. For every man threw down his rod and it became serpents. I can't explain it to you beyond that, which is, I can't explain it to you. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And the result was Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Next thought, verse 13 of Exodus 7. And he did not heed them as the Lord had said he wouldn't. So the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning when he goes out to the water, and you shall stand by the riverbank to meet him. And the rod which was turned into a serpent you shall take in your hand, and you shall say to him, to Pharaoh, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed, until now, you would not hear. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that are in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink the water of the river. Okay, so again, just what I'm trying to help us to do, among other things, is think how awestruck Israel should be and how much they should worship and serve God, and how much they should know without much thinking at all that, okay, Pharaoh has magicians and he can duplicate some things, but it's limited. And so, of course, it happened as and we go forward in chapter 7, the fish that were in the river died, the river stank, the Egyptians couldn't drink the water in the river, there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard. And he did not heed them, as the Lord had said. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and neither was his heart moved by this. So all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink, because they could not drink the water of the river. And 7 days passed. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to just run a list here. As they moved on from the water turned to blood, the next plague was frogs. In chapter 8 and verse 1. And the magicians told to do the same by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says he's not going to let him go. Verse 8, chapter 8 and verse 16, it's lice struck the land. And dust of the land turned to lice. And the magicians tried but couldn't replicate that one. And the magicians told Moses, quote, "This is the finger of God." The magicians said, we can, my feeling is in some way they had some form of magic that made it look like, but on the other hand, that's not what the text says. So I'm not trying to water down, but whatever they did, they recognized that what was done with the lice was the finger of God, and they couldn't replicate it. So how they could replicate what they did, I don't know. Not worried about that too much. Mainly, I'm worried about the fact that I don't get the impact that I should get. Our God, consistent with his program at a given time, can make things live, make things die, and make things that are comfortable and make things that are miserable. And lice would be a pretty bad one. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. In chapter 8 and verse 21, flies all over the land. And if there's one thing I don't like, is flies. And God made a difference between the land where the Israelites lived in Goshen and the land where the Pharaoh and his people lived in the rest of Egypt. There were no flies for the Israelites, but there were flies all over the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh offers a compromise on this one. Do we ever get in a situation where we're asked, or it's implied that we would maybe be a good thing to compromise? So Pharaoh tries to compromise. He says, go sacrifice in the land. Chapter 8 and verse 25. Moses refuses. He said, we asked for 3 days in the wilderness to sacrifice. And he goes on to say that if we were to sacrifice in the land, we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians in the land, the livestock, and the Egyptians would take that as an occasion to kill the Israelites. And that's in chapter 8 and verse 26. Maybe that's what Pharaoh had in mind. I don't know. Pharaoh offered another compromise, and again, Moses rejected in Exodus 8, 29 and on. And then another plague comes, and now we're in chapter 9 and verse 1, and a great pestilence is going to come on the livestock. And not on the livestock of the Israelites, but only on the livestock of the Egyptians. And all the livestock of the Egyptians, were told, died, but none of the stock of Israel died. That ought to get your attention. It's not that something just wiped out all the livestock, some pestilence in the land, but it wiped out the livestock owned by the Egyptians, and it didn't bother the livestock owned by the Hebrews at all. Should get the attention of everybody, but I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of Israel, because Israel's going to get together and make a gold calf and says, these be thy gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt. And they're going to eat and drink and play. That's a bad combination. The next one is boils. And Moses scattered the ashes, and all of the ashes turned into boils when they touched the people. And the magicians couldn't stand before Pharaoh because they had boils all over them and they were miserable. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And then hail that destroyed the food crops. Exodus 9:22-26. Worst since Egypt was founded, the worst hailstorm. Egyptians who believed brought their livestock in out of the hail so that they weren't killed. Those who didn't believe, they lost their livestock. But none were killed again of the children of Israel in Goshen. No hail. The Israelites and their stock lived. And he still hardens his heart. And then in chapter 10, locusts come on the land. And of course, they destroy anything that's edible about. And then darkness in chapter 10 and verse 21 comes over the whole land, so dark that it could almost be felt. And of course, they didn't have electrical generators, as far as I know anything about. And so it'd be a different ball game than for us. We will get a flashlight. Sometimes I got to where I don't put the attention I need on flashlights, and I need a flashlight and I can't find one. And I find one and the battery's dead. But they didn't have a flashlight. They didn't have batteries either. But the darkness is so dark that it could be felt almost. And still, Pharaoh's heart is hard. And then the last, probably the most severe, and it was the beginning of the year for Israel. From that point on, the killing of the firstborn. Israel was told, and I would understand that some Egyptians probably followed suit, but that they were to take a lamb, they were to kill it, catch the blood in a basin, take hyssop, which was a fairly common wood, and dip it in the blood and then strike it over the top and the side post of the door. And then everybody that was inside that door was to eat the Passover supper. It's the first Lord's Passover supper down in Egypt. And they were told what to eat. They were told what to wear. They were told they're to have their staff in their hand and their sandals on their feet. They were to eat unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and an animal that was a clean animal, pure animal. And they were to be ready to march because they were going to be thrust out of Egypt. Egyptians are going to tell them to get out. So they witnessed all this. They witnessed all this over a period of time. They witnessed when it first started the fact that Pharaoh at first rejected, of course, Moses and Aaron, and said, "You guys aren't working hard enough." He was worried about going and offer sacrifices, and that's where he withdrew the straw from the brick making process, and still insisted that they go find the scrounge for it themselves and make the same amount of bricks. And some of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron because they were making life miserable for them. They're aggravating the Egyptians, and even at that point, they weren't willing to say, "Well, this is not good. This isn't what we expected, but God is the one that's going to deliver us, and this is the way it's going to happen." Excuse me. This is the way it's going to happen. So in Genesis chapter 9, we have not Genesis, Exodus chapter 9 and verse 27, we have an interesting dialogue with Pharaoh. Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron, and he said, "I've sinned this time." I don't know what about all the other times, but I've sinned this time. The Lord is righteous. My people and I are now wicked. Entreat the Lord that there be no more mighty thundering and hail, for it is enough. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. So Moses said to him, "As soon as I've gone out of the city, I will spread out my hand to the Lord, and the thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, that you may know that the earth is the Lord's." Okay, so again, this is what Israel would have been aware of. And then Moses says, "But as for you and your servants, I know you will not yet fear the Lord God." You will not, you haven't got it, Pharaoh. And a lot of times people confess their sins or say they're sorry or wish they hadn't done it or whatever. And Moses says, "You haven't got it." And so in verse 34 of chapter 9, Pharaoh says, "Saw the rain, the hail, the thunder ceased. He sinned yet more." He compounded. He hardened his heart, he and his servants. So the heart of Pharaoh was hard, neither would he let the children of Israel go to the Lord, as the Lord had spoken by Moses. So, just with that background, now move forward to Mount Sinai. They've wandered from Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've had victory over Pharaoh and his army when he had a change of heart after he had killed all of the firstborn in his household, where there wasn't blood on the top and the side post of the door. The firstborn in the Egyptian households, where there was blood on the top and the side post of the door, no one died. They borrowed from the Egyptians because God has softened the hearts of the Egyptians so that they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for and urged them to get out, go. And so now and then, as I've said earlier, they go to Mount Sinai. They are sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai. And we read in Exodus 32:1, when people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, okay, again, these are the people that have seen all of the power and might and the way that God could afflict and ultimately destroy a great nation. And they've been waiting a few days for Moses to come down from the mountain, and they get impatient. I don't know, they got bored. I don't know. And so they go to Moses, go to Aaron, and they say, quote, this is what they said. This was their pitch. "Come make us gods," small g, by the way. "Come make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Well, what about the God that led, directed, and empowered Moses, the man who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Has he gone somewhere, you think? But it, and Aaron said to them, and again, can you believe that Aaron of all people knew he should have jumped up and said, hey, wait. Moses went up in the mountain to get the commandments of the Lord that you committed yourself to him that you would keep. And now you want me to make a God, make gods that shall go before us to take the place of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that has delivered us from Egypt and is taking us on the way to the promised land that he promised 4 generations before to Abraham. But I don't know where Aaron was. And Aaron said to them, so all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And then he said, again, this is Aaron, Moses' right-hand man, the one that was the speaker, you might say, the mouthpiece for Moses, because when God called Moses, Moses said, I don't know how to talk. Well, this one time when he shouldn't have talked, but anyway, he does. This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. That golden calf that they just made with the gold that they took from the Egyptians as they come out of Egypt. Now, what kind of logic is that? And so when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. What Lord? Oh, the Lord golden calf that I just made with the gold that you took from your ears, your earrings and things, and gave them to me. And then the 6th verse of the 32nd chapter says of Exodus, then they rose early the next day. They offered burnt offerings, and they brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. After they had made offerings, burnt offerings and peace offerings to this golden calf. After Aaron declared that this is your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt, after they'd seen the power of Almighty God, up to and including the drowning of Pharaoh and his chariots that pursued them across through the water. And the Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, that I may consume them, and I'll make of you a great nation. Well, Moses, consistent with Moses' humility and his love for the Lord and God's program and in the Lord's name, he tries to talk the Lord out of it and does. But to stop and think, here are people that have seen more in the way of God's might and power in the physical movement on earth than I've ever seen and ever will see, as far as physically interacting to change the natural course of events, in this case, to bring Pharaoh to his knees to where he would let Israel go and thrust them out of the land, and the people, the Egyptians, would be willing to give them whatever they wanted in the way of gold and jewelry and things of that nature, and then ultimately take Pharaoh's life and the life of his chariot drivers and their horses and all that. And then to stand there at the foot of this Mount Sinai, and I don't know what they thought they were going to get back, but to get the law from God, it starts out, "Thou shalt have no other God before me." It's amazing, and yet it's the kind of thing that happens with people. We forget pretty quickly. We're standing here today. This is Sunday, the 24th of December. And tomorrow, a lot of people are going to go worship, they think, God by celebrating his birthday at a time that's very close to the period of time in which heathens celebrate the birth of the sun in the sky, because the days stopped getting shorter and now they should start getting longer, and I'm ready for them to do that. But there's nowhere in the Bible that even suggests that we should celebrate the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. No place. There's no place in the Bible that suggests that we should observe the Mass, the Roman Catholic Mass, for anything that I know anything about. But we're going to play. They're going to play. They're buying toys. I tried to get my Wi-Fi switched over so I could be doing this at the house we just moved into from the house that I'm standing in right now. And the only thing is here is my desk and my computer so that I could do live stream from here. But because they're going to eat and they're going to drink and they're going to play. They're going to eat, they're going to drink, and they're going to play. And singing is something that is really a part of Christian life. But we're told in Hebrews 10 that we should assemble ourselves together and not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. We're told in Hebrews 13:15 that we should continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. We're told in Ephesians 5:19 to speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual song, singing and making melody in our heart to the Lord. And Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell in us richly in all wisdom, teaching, admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. But when Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai was singing, it wasn't spiritual songs. It wasn't spiritual songs. And yet, at that point, they were allowed to be guided into doing something completely contrary to what would honor God, and they should have known it. They should have loved him enough. They should have known enough of what was going on in the land that they were going to occupy, that it was the sins of those idolatrous people that worshiped the sun in the sky, not the Son of God, that will enable them to occupy the land, because God was going to take it away from the people that occupied it and give it to the nation Israel. So when we live in a world that our most critical thing is to eat and drink, sing, and play. Play, I think, is necessary for kids. Parents, if you have kids, you should play with them, you and your kids. But even today, literally billions. I had some statistics. I'm not going to have time to go into it, but I'll stop there. Millions of dollars. Billions, not millions. Billions with a B. Sporting events, $55.9 billion US dollars on sporting events in the 12 months prior to August 2017 and November 27th. Billions. And I got lots of them. But life is not about play. Life is about righteousness, godliness, and sin is generally what is a byproduct of most of our entertainment and most of our play. And our music, how much of it may be religious? Is it really spiritual songs? Singing and making melody in our heart to the Lord? Good. It's good if it is. If it isn't, it isn't. I'll stop there. May the Lord bless you. We'll be back together again this coming Tuesday. Goodbye.